Sira.
Let's talk about Ben Sira, or sometimes as he is known, Jesus, son of Sira. It's not a name you see very often.
Nowadays, but back then.
Well, I mean, but even back then, like maybe Yeshua or Yehoshua is not terribly uncommon, but to see it rendered as Jesus, I don't know. I feel like that tends to get reserved for the Jesus.
So you think maybe somebody was making a point when they did it like that?
Yeah, perhaps. So, Ben Sira was probably originally written in Hebrew, but still in the sort of Hellenistic Egyptian Jewish community. For generations, the only extant copy known was the Greek translation written with a prologue by his grandson, by Ben Sira's grandson. That's who wrote the Greek translation. That's the version that was codified in the Christian Bible. But then later, Hebrew manuscripts were found in the Cairo Geniza and in the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they were able to piece together a little bit more of the original. It's not very far off because it was translated by his grandson. It is, you know, like there's like a family connection there, and he is clearly concerned with sharing his grandfather's wisdom. So it's not terribly, you know, distorted for other political or like social movement gains, as we've seen with some of the other Apocrypha. But he even says himself, the grandson, in his prologue, that like every translation is an interpretation, and that like there's going to be some differences here by necessity. And so my my annotated copy kind of gives a lot of those, and sometimes they're not like, it's not a huge difference, but sometimes there's like whole lines that were omitted from the Hebrew into the Greek, or like several, you know, passages, which is interesting. I'm not really clear on why those were omitted. And they're not like, it doesn't drastically change the nature of the book one way or the other. They're not pieces of wisdom that change radically from the other 50 chapters. So maybe his grandson, just like his hand got tired and he was like, I'm done with this chapter. It just like stopped translating that. But I don't really know. Yeah, I'm curious what you all thought of it, with how much of it you were able to read. I know it's not all translated on Sepharia, and the the one that I also linked from the Christian like Bible site, is not very far off from the one that I read, because the annotated copy, as I mentioned, like the first or second class, this book is using the New Standard Revised Version, which is an ecumenical Christian translation of these apocryphal works. So it's not very different, except that my copy also had the prologue from the grandson, since it was a Greek translation, and this book of Sirach or Ecclesiastes version from the Christian website, even though it's clearly the English translation of the Greek translation, it doesn't have the Greek prologue. And then the Sepharia version appears to be the Hebrew, which is maybe partially why some of it's not translated, because I don't know, those were pieces that were left out in the Greek. I'm not sure. Anyway, yeah, so I'm curious how much of it you all were able to read and what you thought of what you did read and that sort of thing.
I read a couple of chapters of the Proverbs and couldn't hold them in my head. And I mean, I thought about writing down some that meant something, and I never got that far. And then I just flipped toward the end, and I got into some of the history. And I read that thing that you gave us, the commentary on it, and he talked about this having history. So I was glad I saw that, and I remembered, I think, what you had talked about, some of the stuff about David, for instance, being sort of political. Obviously, the people that wrote the one that got canonized were in David's camp, and so that was kind of interesting reading what Ben Sira had to say about it from that point of view. Especially, see, he really dissed Nathan in one sentence, and then but went on to brag about how wonderful David was. And anyway, so that was my overview.
Yeah, I agree that it's hard to just read 44 chapters of Proverbs. Like, it's a lot of sayings that are clearly meant, like, they're like fortune cookie inserts, you know, like how many in a row can you read and hold on to at once? Although I did feel like they were organized better than Solomon's Proverbs, like the book of Proverbs that's in the Bible, which sometimes there's like a connection from one to the other, but often there's not. And there's no like reason for the chapters, like there's nothing that groups them together. Whereas Ben Sira's, sometimes they're a little non sequitur, but a lot of them have, they're grouped together with clearly some more intention. And at least the Greek version, like my copy has like titles, not of all the chapters, but of several sections that it says like the Greek has these headings, these subtitles sort of in them. The Hebrew manuscripts didn't have that, but Ben Sira's grandson clearly felt like there was themes to it. So I did like that. Felt like that was a little easier to take in than reading the whole book of Proverbs, like the canonical Proverbs. But it's still a bit hard. And then, yeah, like, and then 43 to 50 or whatever it is, suddenly we get a whole overview of the entire Tanakh. No, it's not 43. I'm trying to scroll to that. Yeah, 44. Yeah, and see my copy, I don't know if you can see, it has a little title on top, the hymn of our ancestors or whatever. And the annotation says like this, the Greek book literally has that title in it as it breaks chapters. So yeah. What else? Who else?
In the first chapter, there was some mentions of like wisdom and how valuable wisdom is, and from the parts that I read, it seemed like a lot of other things that we've read together that, you know, for me, it feels like something that somebody wanted to leave behind for their the next generation.
Yeah. Yeah, he absolutely was writing for it's like an instruction manual, right? Which we talked about with the canonical book of Proverbs too, that you know, it's clearly intended for like middle class men to teach their sons. There are some parts of it, or like, I don't know, the overall tone of it doesn't feel as misogynistic to me as a lot of Proverbs does, but there are certainly still, there's a lot of concern about prostitutes, and a lot of, it's like, beat your children for that in order to make them good people. So it's like not timeless, certainly does not carry over to today, but there are aspects of it that you can see why, like what the value of it was in its time.
Part of the concern about prostitutes, not so much a concern of prostitution, although sure that's there too, but a concern of the fact that so many of the other religions had prostitution as part of them, and it was sort of a warning to stay away from that, or
Yeah, I mean, in general, that was often a concern. And there are references, I think in Kings, I forget which book it is, but in our Bible, there are references to the like Kadashot, that's somebody had installed sacred prostitutes into our temple, which is like, you know, usually a pagan thing, and that it was a problem. In Ben Sira, I'm not super convinced that's what he's talking about. I think he's just concerned about sexual wantonness. It could be also partially the shift that the Hellenistic Jews were more monogamous than like the ancient Hebrews before them. And so although there's also some passages in Ben Sira about adultery, and like clearly the punishment is harsher, or the social judgment is harsher for women than for men, I think there's still a general sentiment of like that each person should only be with one person, which is like relatively new for the religious wisdom of that time and place. What?
I was going to say the commentary that you listed, the Torah.com commentary, where he compares Ben Sira to Ecclesiastes as opposed to Proverbs, and he talked about he couldn't understand why Ecclesiastes was canonized and this wasn't. But I went back and read a very little bit. Just I didn't have time or inclination to read all of Ecclesiastes again. But do you think he was right in when he compared the faith of Ben Sira's to the lack of I guess classic Jewish faith in Ecclesiastes, to everybody getting his due as opposed to what's gonna get you is gonna get you?
It's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure why he compared those two, other than that the name is like, it makes for a good article, like Ecclesiastes over Ecclesiasticus or whatever. Oh, that's not actually the name of the article. It says it somewhere. The strange choice. There we go. Strange choice of Ecclesiastes over Ecclesiasticus. But But like he does say elsewhere, it reads much more like the book of Proverbs. And I do agree to some extent with his overall like analysis. I mean, we talked about when we read Ecclesiastes that even clearly the people who canonized it were a little uncomfortable with it, that there's like that tacked on bit at the end of like, and praise God, everything is in God's hands. After all of this, you know, line after line of like the nihilism and the depression and everything, then there's this like, you know, just weird little ending that's supposed to like sort of uplifting and does express faith in God that like clearly isn't the same author. And so whereas Ben Sira like is, you know, I don't think he's overly optimistic or what's the word, like some parts of Proverbs feel too reliant on God. Like it's unrealistic that the way that the justice system, the divine justice works out in Proverbs. And while there's a little bit of that in Ben Sira, like he still seems to believe in a divine justice, but it's not always like, it doesn't mean that the wicked will get their comeuppance necessarily. It means that they will be remembered as wicked. And so there's a lot of that in Ben Sira, which I also liked, that you could, if you wanted to, you could read a little bit in that of reference to divine punishment in the afterlife. But the annotations say that's not what it's talking about. It's just talking about like, about the legacy we leave behind. And so there's a lot of that of like, remember the day of your death, you know, that you will die and who you are as a person will be enshrined forever. And like, what kind of person do you want people to remember you by? So there's a lot of that in Ben Sira that I think is, it just feels more practical than Proverbs, but more faithful than Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. And so the question, it never really occurred to me to ask, why is Ecclesiastes canonized? The only one I've ever wondered that about is Song of Songs. And I don't have an answer to that. So I don't know why Ecclesiastes was canonized. I do think Ecclesiasticus, Ben Sira, would have made a good addition to the Bible. And it seems like the two main reasons that it didn't make it into the Bible, one is that it is a fairly later date of writing, that it was probably like the translation into the Greek is contemporaneous with the canonization process. And by then the people deciding were like, well, we know who wrote it, so is it really that special? Whereas they had all these other oral traditions that went back generations that were being canonized. And then the other thing is that it was so popular with the followers of Jesus that seems to have put the rabbis off. So even though they quote Ben Sira in the Talmud, and my annotated copies have a lot of comments that are like, you know, this line in the Talmud doesn't quote Ben Sira directly, but like says the exact same thing and like that kind of stuff. So clearly they liked it too, but they were wary of putting too much claim on it because it was being used so religiously by people they were trying to like right at that time where that separation was becoming much more codified and important, you know, between Christians and Jews. And so that seems to have been a huge factor in not canonizing Ben Sira, which is a shame and just goes to show nothing is apolitical.
Nothing.
Nothing.
The author of the commentary seemed to think that it was mostly a matter of time, that it was too late to be attributed to God, whereas everything that was canonized is attributed more or less to God. I mean, some things are written by Solomon, but I guess under God's tutelage or something like that. But and
Yeah.
then I did like his another way he had of separating the difference between canonized things and uncanonized things is that you're allowed to read the uncanonized ones in the bathroom. I thought that was
Well, there's always that. I missed that one. Oh, there it is. For example, in the bathroom.
I've seen the Apocrypha often in other people's bathrooms.
Yeah, you know, like in hotels, the bedside table drawer has the Gideon's Bible, but the bathroom drawer has the Apocrypha.
Right. That's so funny.
But I guess it does point out the separation, I guess, between what has been canonized and what has not been canonized. And
Yeah. Right. Well, and I think it goes back to, I mean, that line kind of goes back to the question we discussed in the first class that from that, I think it was Marx v. Bretler's article. One of the other articles from Torah.com that I linked 4 weeks ago, of like that question of authority, of biblical authority, and how we lend a certain level of kavod. I mean, I don't even know, I mean, honor, but it feels so much weightier. In English, it doesn't feel like the right word, but you know, this level of kavod to the canonized texts and to the, you know, to the credit of the people who decided what was canonized and what's not, like, because there's this you know, like almost this magic to it of the things that we can't trace who exactly wrote them. You know, these things that have this long oral tradition and have been possibly exaggerated in their retellings over time, so that by the time they're written down, they are, you know, hard to discern exactly what's happening. And there's all this, you know, sort of magical divine intervention and all of these things that it's so much weightier than like this. I really liked Ben Sira. I thought this was, I mean, like I said, there were certainly parts that don't resonate with today, but there were also a lot of parts that that do resonate, and his overall sort of demeanor feels, I don't know, I thought the book seemed like a really valid piece of wisdom and outlook on life, but you know, like, who is he to tell us what the right way to live is? Like, you know, it's just Ben Sira. It's not King Solomon inspired by God himself, you know, it's just this guy. So you know, I guess I get that, to why he can be bathroom reading and Proverbs can't be.
translation.
Sure is it.
Why? Okay.
Did you feel like this one helps you understand it all? the historical context, what the life of Hellenized Jews in Egypt might be like. The way Tobit did a little bit.
I don't think I read it enough to get that.
Okay.
So, for instance,
This section on, well, there's a few sections like this, but sort of toward the end, when he talks about how to behave at a banquet. Where is it? Chapter 40, maybe? No, 30. I'm not sure now. So, toward the end, before the history piece, there's like, and this is a theme that's a little bit repeated throughout of how, oh, Juliet's in the waiting room. Whoops. How to behave socially, what to expect of your friends, how to engage with social contracts, things like that I feel like, I don't know, it gives us a little bit of the, what'd you say?
Like Miss Manners.
Yeah, it's a little like Miss Manners. It gives you some insight as to what the social norms of the day were and what sort of the expectations of his world would have been. And it's very communal minded, but also a little mistrustful. Like he says somewhere, this is not in this section that I'm trying to find with the banquet, but at another point further up, earlier on, he's like, it says something like, if you give a loan, let it not be like money you depend on. Like basically he says, like, don't necessarily expect it back. And if you take out a loan, though, pay it back as quickly as you can, and don't be giving out other people loans while you still owe other money and things like that. So there's a lot of that sort of like, I don't know, it feels a little like court politics, like, I don't know. I don't watch like Downton Abbey or Bridgerton or any of those, but it's sort of how I imagine those shows to be, of like the gossip behind the fans and whatever.
So he would definitely be against a Ponzi scheme.
Yes. Definitely against a Ponzi scheme. Hi, Juliet.
Hi.
Did you have anything about Ben Sira that you wanted to discuss in particular?
Not really. He just basically was being a Jewish mother.
Put your sweater on.
I like the integrity of Safaria in translating things the way they saw it, even if it didn't make any sense, and didn't pretend to know what he meant.
Yeah.
They just said, okay, this says this. I don't know why it says that, but here it is.
Related to what you said, did you explain why some of the sections were not translated? Is it just no one's gotten to it yet, or?
Yeah, my guess is, so I have two guesses, and it might be somewhere in between. One is that Safaria is user-based and volunteer run. So it could just be nobody's had time to do it yet. But based on where the gaps are, I also suspect that it might have something to do with the Hebrew versus Greek manuscript, that the English translations of the Greek are much more available, and they're not, and like this is clearly the Hebrew, and so that it might be sections that like have never been translated before, or like are missing in some manuscripts and things like that. That might be part of the problem.
Does anybody go and look at the Hebrew and say, yes, that Greek does match it? Or in other words,
I don't read Greek, so I don't.
well, I know we don't, but
Greek and
does anybody?
Uh-huh.
I mean, somebody must, but
Yeah.
like the annotators of my book, for example, like I'm reading it in English. They say that this is the English translation based on the like mainstream Protestant Bible, you know, of the Greek translation of Ben Sira. But then the annotations say like, this is what the Greek manuscripts, or this is what the Hebrew manuscripts say. So clearly they have had access to those as well, and like done some cross comparisons. But like I said, there just weren't, I mean, we read that book about the Cairo Geniza in book club. They found that in the 40s or 20s or something. Like it's the 20th century that the Cairo Geniza was discovered, and the Qumran scrolls are like 30. I mean, really recent, right? Like those scrolls were discovered in my lifetime, I think. So if you like, that's how long it took to find the Hebrew manuscripts of this book. The Greek was the one that was passed down for 2,000 years. So it might still be a work in progress to get it, you know, to get a sort of unified, definitive Hebrew version of this book.
Do you know who undertakes that sort of thing to say, okay, this is you know, we've worked together, now this is the best translation we can promote, produce?
It takes teams to do that for sure.
Does it happen like in Israel? Or in universities, or you know,
Universities probably,
ancient
and it
Greek?
might be like when it comes to the Qumran scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, those are I'm pretty sure they are property of Israel, even though, and we looked this up a little last time, right, that they've made the rounds, but they are owned by like the Israeli Archaeology Society or whatever. So it might have to go through them, but it would take like teams of academics from across disciplines to really do it a good service and come up with that like definitive translation of the Hebrew or whatever. And it would probably take people who know the ancient Hebrew and the Greek and like could cross-reference and, you know, that kind of thing too.
Like the guy in My Father's Paradise book.
Yeah.
I seem to remember in perhaps the same book that you just referenced, Rabbi, but there are scholars in different universities in different countries, and then when there are translations that match each other, then it's like, okay, we've got several different translations that really are saying the same thing.
Right.
And then I don't know about the Greek to Hebrew, or who's doing that, like Nancy has.
Right. Bless you, Chava. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like doing like a double blind study, right? That you have to have the different translators working without being in communication with each other to just kind of test to make sure that they're getting the same
Right.
translations, and then but then somebody has to also put them in contact with each other eventually, or cross reference the various versions and whatever. It does not sound like an easy task, which is why the editors of this annotated book were like, we're going to use the translations that exist because we trust that the scholarship was good, and we'd rather spend our time providing the notes and historical context than retranslating.
So when translations appear in Safaria, I don't see any credits given on the pages that we see, but do people know who does the translations, and is somebody double checking, or just somebody does a translation and poof, it appears, or you don't know?
I'm not sure if this is still true. I haven't tried to edit in a long time, but like when I was in rabbinical school and Safaria was still new, the text of all of Rambam's Mishnah Torah was on Safaria, but none of it was translated. So as we went and I had to translate it for school, then I would upload it onto Safaria, because it was easier for my notes too to have it. I take notes on my computer, but I would have the physical book, and it was too hard to translate that way. So I would translate it in Safaria, and then I would have it for my notes. And then it was just there, and anyone else, I don't know if anyone has gone and fixed it since then, because I'm sure mine weren't the perfect, but I did fix them in class too. So whatever corrections I got from the teacher went on Safaria. So it used to, like Wikipedia, that you can just change it and it can be up until someone notices that it's wrong and somebody else changes it, it's very user.
I think they have editors, but they couldn't possibly get to everything. And that, I mean, libraries won't use Wikipedia as a source because of that.
Right.
And I think they encourage kids in school not to cite Wikipedia as a source, because you don't know who the source is.
Right. Yeah. So Safaria is like that, where you don't really know who the source is. And some of it, like all of the Torah, maybe all of the Tanakh on Wikipedia, is the JPS translation. So the big brown books that we have some of at the temple, it's that same version that's on Wikipedia, and there are notes in there. I'm not on Wikipedia, sorry, on Safaria. There are notes in there that will tell you, like if the JPS says Hebrew uncertain or whatever, Safaria will say the same thing. But a lot of it is just user updated. So
When the professionals are translating, do they take into account the region where it came from and when they're translating?
yeah, if they know it, I mean, that's part of the process too, which is again, like, so far outside of my language skills. If you gave me like a script of Hebrew of it from any time period, I would roughly be able to tell you what it says. If you ask me like what time period it's from, I could not tell you. Like maybe based on the grammar, I could tell you if it's ancient or modern. But if it's ancient, I can't tell you if it's biblical or Mishnaic or even like Aramaic sometimes. I've mentioned before, Aramaic has more olives. That's how I know the difference. But otherwise, like so much of the root is the same that that's what I'm looking at, is what are the roots here so I can identify the basic translations. I don't have any of those other skills, but real scholars do, that can tell you based on the type of Hebrew, like based on the way that the syntax flows and whatever else, that they have a pretty good idea of like this 100-year window and this, region of the Jewish world. And so that's going to affect also the translation process,
Right.
because part of it's the language itself, but part of it's like knowing, okay, well, the grammar structure here means that it had to have been written in Egypt in the, 200 CE, which means this is the kind of political dealings that they were dealing with, which means this word is actually a metaphor for this other thing. And, like that kind of stuff comes into play.
That's what I was wondering about, the if you will, the culture, the issues that were occurring when the particular section was written.
Yeah, so like, for example, at the end of Ben Sira, he has this line about the 3 countries that he hates. 51, the end of chapter 50. 2 nations my soul detests, and the third is not even a people. Those who live in Seir, and the Philistines, and the foolish people that live in Shechem. So those 3 places are biblical, right? Seir is like the fields of Sedom. That's the area where Esau settled after both boys leave Isaac and Rebekah's home. The Philistines, of course, are the ongoing enemies in the time of the judges. And Shechem is, there are a few things with Shechem, but it's where Dinah is raped and her brothers kill everyone in the town. It's one of the sites of battle during in the books of Samuel. So whatever. So these places have biblical meaning. But now that's not the right annotation. Hold on. My notes in the annotation say, this is probably a veiled curse of Israel's contemporary of Ben Sira's time enemies. The Idumeans, which was a culture of people who lived in Seir. The Seleucids, the Greek overlords, is probably who he actually means when he says Philistines. And the Samaritans are probably who he actually means when he says those who live in Shechem. So we see 3 like biblical enemies of Israel, and he means 3 like real cultures that were living in that land at the time that he was living in Egypt.
So the translators, seems to me, would also need to be historical scholars as well as, I don't know, linguistic or.
Yeah, I don't think you learn dead languages without also being historians, though.
Right. Okay. Since I only speak one language, I would know nothing.
I mean, like Greek and Hebrew are technically languages that people still speak, but when people who are translating this kind of stuff are looking at the ancient versions they're effectively dead languages. So I don't think you are doing this kind of translation work if you're not also a historian.
Okay. That makes sense.
Rabbi, I just noticed in 50, it mentions Simon, son of Johanan, and then down below, it mentions Simon, son of Jesus. And is it the same Simon, or is they talking 2 Simons?
I think they're talking 2 Simons. So I don't, on chapter 50?
Yes, after the 2 next. Oh, wait, that was right before.
Where's the first one?
Well, the first one is in the first paragraph. Well, number 1 of Ben Sira 50. No, wait.
Yeah, the first
first one.
paragraph of 50, and then toward almost the last the
Right,
last paragraph in 50.
I guess it's number 27 of 50.
Okay. Simon, son of Yochanan. That's interesting. My copy says Simon, son of Onias.
Oh, oh,
Well, it does say they're talking about a priest, so.
Yeah,
yeah.
so they're talking about a priest. All right, the note says the high priest Simon II was in office from 219 to 196 BCE, perhaps during Ben Sira's own lifetime. The high priest combined what we would call civic and religious functions. Ben Sira praises him for his building activities. According to the lunar calendar, both Passover and Tabernacles fall on the full moon. Okay. And then the next one, so Simon, son of Jesus, I think is him, and is Ben Sira. Because one of the other versions I found say Shimon ben Yeshua ben Sira, or Ben Sira. So I think this is his own lineage that he's giving here at the bottom of the chapter.
Yeah, what
27.
it says, the
What?
words of, it says the words of Simon, son of Jesus, who is called Ben Sira. So yeah,
Oh, okay. Yeah,
in
So
31. Yeah.
my version says, yeah, instruction in understanding and knowledge I have written in this book. Jesus, son of Eliezer, son of Sirach of Jerusalem, whose mind poured forth wisdom. And yeah, meaning of Greek, uncertain here. So yeah, those are different Simons. Yeah. It was interesting to me how much honor he still gives to the priests, considering it's post destruction of the temple, or not post destruction of the temple, but post. He doesn't live in the land of Israel with a temple, so post exile is the word I wanted. But he's still like, there's still some hierarchy in the social structure that gives honors to the priests.
And he knows his history.
And he knows his history.
Why did the priests stop to exist? I know about the destruction of the temple, but then when they rebuilt the temple, were there priests again?
Yeah. So when they rebuilt the temple, there were priests again, and at first it was established through the line of Levi again, like Ezra. I'm pretty sure is like he's named as a Levite, as a Kohen, when he like reestablishes the temple rights. But then somewhere along the way it gets corrupted. It's a little unclear to me whether or not the Hasmoneans, I think they were actually priests. They were of the line of Levi, of Aaron's descendants, but they corrupted it by also being kings, because they're supposed to be, they're like separate branches of government, the temple and the monarchy. And so by being both, that kind of messed things up. And then Herod comes along and murders all of the line of Levi and institutes his own like Roman pawns, puppets, as priests. And so that also disturbed things. And like that's part of Some historians believe like that's part of the Jesus story, is like what he's protesting against isn't necessarily the priesthood or like the Jewish way of worship in the temple in general, but specifically that it's gotten so corrupted and that the priests are accepting bribes from Rome, and like that they're not real they're not descended from Aaron and all of that kind of stuff. So that's part of the problem. And then when the temple was destroyed a second time, I think there was still for a short time some like kavod or some extra weight put on scribes and scholars, sages who did come from that line, but it quickly just sort of didn't matter anymore because there was no more temple and there wasn't going to be another temple, and and the rabbinic age was coming up and anyone could be a rabbi. And I think especially after Akiva, who is not quite in the first round of rabbis, but he is in like the first two, he's pre the year 200, he's part of the Mishnah. And he's this like poor nobody who learns how to read at the age of 40 and becomes one of the most famous rabbis. So once he did it, it was like, well, what are we gatekeeping for about, these people from the line of Aaron? So, people still claim that they know if they're a Kohen, but I find it spurious.
Oh, I thought Kohen and Levites were different.
They are. So Levites, that's a tribe. Aaron and Moses were both Levites.
Okay.
And then so Aaron's line specifically are the Kohens, are the priests. So they all Levites worked in the temple, but only Kohens were priests. So in traditional, what?
Like priest and Monsignor.
Sure. I thought Monsignor was another word for priest, like depending on
They're a higher.
He's a higher up.
Okay.
There is a hierarchy, priest or whatever, curate, whatever they call them. And then the Monsignor, and then Cardinal, and then
Okay.
Oh, I'm no Bishop, Monsignor,
Cardinal.
Bishop, Cardinal, Pope.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I knew about the last three. I guess I didn't know about the priest to Monsignor line. Anyway, in some synagogues, they call up aliyahs in that order too. Like the first aliyah is always given to a Kohen, and the second is always given to a Levite, and then the third through seventh, if you're doing all seven, are given to Joe Schmoes. But I don't know. Like I said, I just like
Sixth one's given to horse traders.
What?
I just learned the sixth one is given to people like horse stealers, and I don't know.
I never knew Joe Schmo was Jewish.
Pony.
It was Schmolowitz. They changed it short.
I was gonna say Shlomo.
Joe Shlomo.
Joe Shlomo.
Yeah. I was gonna say something else about
I'm sorry.
all that, and then I forgot. Oh, somebody called the other day asking for the owner of our business, and I was like, what business do you think you're calling? And he said, Congregation Ner Shalom. I said, oh yeah, okay, you are correct, that's who you've called. He's like, so is this then I guess he like realized what he was, because he must have just had a list of like whatever in the neighborhood. It was like office supplies or whatever. So he goes, so is this the priest or the pastor? I said, it's the rabbi. And then he hung up. I think maybe he didn't know what a rabbi was and thought I was messing with him.
Didn't think
That's
women could
funny.
be
So who
rabbis.
owns our business?
No, it comes in handy. We had some Latter-day Saint missionaries come to the door, and I just had to say, well, hi guys, but we're Jewish and we're happy with our faith, and they smiled and went on their way. So it's fine.
When Jehovah's Witnesses come to my door, I get to tell them that my son is a Jehovah's Witness, and they go away. It's true, but they go away.
Yeah, hold on, Nancy, have a phone call the Johos. So you could have answered, who's the owner of our business? Well, that would be God.
Right.
He's not available to you today.
He's busy.
Or you could give the names of our 3 trustees, or
Or your name, Debbie, maybe he wants to eat kibbutz.
Well, it's been delightful reading Apocrypha with you all. So this is the end of this round of adult ed. By request, I am doing a few weeks of weekday Torah study again. It will not be all year. I just can't keep, now that like life has kind of gone back to normal, I can't
Right.
keep doing it. But at least starting November 8th through December 20th, we'll do a few weeks of like the juicy parshas. We're in Genesis now. That takes us through like the beginning of Exodus. So we'll do that. And then in January, by request also, I put out the call of what other topics people would like to study this year, and got one for Jewish humor. So we'll do 5 weeks on the history and analysis of Jewish humor. And then if anyone has any other topic suggestions, I don't have anything for the 5 weeks in June. That's our last round this year. So if you have another topic that you'd like to study in June, let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thanks for these weeks and for the introduction.
Very much.
That's all, folks.
And
That's
happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Hey,
Are you going trick or treating, Rabbi?
No, but I'm wearing my Halloween tights.
Can I ask a question not related to this, but to Ner Shalom?
Yeah.
Does the priest